The world had turned red, and everything he saw was crimson. Only death remained in that place. The main characters couldn't help but wonder if so much violence had been necessary. Memories overwhelmed him as he thought of Sahyung Jangmun, Sajai, and Sajils, all lifeless. A fierce battle between more than 20 different groups, including the 10 Great Sects, and the elite military unit of the Heavenly Demon Sect, had led to everyone's destruction. The blame fell on one man, Chun Ma, the leader of the Heavenly Demon Sect, often called the Heavenly Demon, who seemed like a demonic force sent from the skies. Chun Ma's voice echoed across the crimson battlefield as he spoke to the sole surviving disciple of the Mount Hua Sect. He mentioned the unfortunate fate that had befallen the young warrior, who might have boasted about defeating him for the rest of his life if he had survived. However, Chun Ma admitted that their journey had reached its end, with no way forward. He praised the protagonist's swordsmanship, recognizing the Mount Hua Sect's swordsmanship as the best in the world. But before he could finish, the protagonist, with only one arm left, yelled for Chun Ma to be quiet and charged at him with his sword. Chun Ma continued talking, expressing his regret at not having more time. Just one more day, and he could have lived up to his name. He warned the protagonist that their battle wasn't the end and that demons would return, taking over the world with no one to stop them. As he beheaded Chun Ma, the protagonist's mind raced with thoughts. He pondered the war that had just ended and the approaching certainty of his death. He wondered about the fate of the Mount Hua Sect, with every member and follower lost, leaving only helpless children behind. He questioned whether all the bloodshed caused by the Mount Hua Sect had truly been worthwhile. He regretted not dedicating himself more to training, thinking he might have saved at least one more life. But all these thoughts became meaningless. As he collapsed onto a pile of corpses, he contemplated the fleeting nature of life and the inevitability of its end. He couldn't help but see the poetic beauty in a plum blossom's bloom, which, like life, must eventually come to an end. The 13th disciple of the great Mount Hua Sect, known as the Plum Blossom Sword Saint Chung Myung, took his last breath atop the Heavenly Demon Sect's headquarters mountain after defeating Chun Ma, the source of chaos in the world. This short story would be the only legacy he left behind in this world. A small, abandoned child was found outside the Mount Hua Sect and was taken in as a disciple. As he grew up, he trained alongside other kids his age. One day, an older disciple scolded him, calling him Chung Myung. Chung Myung wondered if his life was flashing before his eyes. The senior disciple scolded him, saying that ethics should come before martial power and that power without ethics was just violence. Chung Myung got tired of hearing the same lecture again and again. He knew he couldn't completely follow all the teachings of the Mount Hua Sect. He felt that he received undeserved attention because of his talents, even though he was still a newcomer. He realized that everything he achieved came from the teachings of the Mount Hua Sect. Suddenly, an old figure appeared and spoke. It was his mentor, Sahyung Jangmun. He asked Chung Myung if he regretted his past. Chung Myung admitted that he did regret it, wishing he had followed the teachings of the Mount Hua Sect more closely and trained harder to change the tragic outcome. However, his mentor comforted him, saying there was no need for regrets. The Mount Hua Sect would endure regardless of what happened. As Chung Myung tried to understand this, he was suddenly hit on the head. He yelled in shock, initially thinking it was Chun Ma who had struck him, but he quickly dismissed that thought since he had already killed Chun Ma, and Chun Ma should be dead. When he opened his eyes, he saw a young beggar holding a bamboo stick. The young beggar repeated the name Chun Ma questioningly, then started shouting and insulting Chung Myung, accusing him of sleeping in while everyone else had already gone to beg. Chung Myung was confused, wondering why this beggar was threatening him. He tried to reason with the young beggar, asking him to put down the bamboo stick. However, the young beggar just laughed, frustrating Chung Myung. Despite being one of the respected Plum Blossom Sword Saints, even by the leader of the Beggars Union, Chung Myung found himself threatened and insulted by a mere child. As he tried to make sense of the situation, the young beggar interrupted his thoughts and attacked him with the bamboo stick, saying that he would die today. Chung Myung quickly tried to block the swing, but was surprised to find that his hand had become incredibly short, too short to effectively block the attack. In a panic, Chung Myung couldn't defend himself, and the attack hit his head. The young beggar continued to attack, thrashing him and shouting in anger. He demanded to know if Chung Myung still didn't understand something, and vowed to make him understand completely. The beggar used to think that there was a point where a person might lose their mind, and a good beating could bring Chung Myung back to reality. The beating kept going, and Chung Myung couldn't defend himself. Then another beggar walked in, saw what was happening, and quietly left, planning to come back later. All you could hear from Chung Myung's room were his desperate pleas for mercy, begging to be spared from the relentless beating. After the beating, Chung Myung sat by a lake, wiping the blood from his nose. He made painful sounds, thinking he'd never been beaten this badly, not even at Mount Hua Sect. Furious and shaking with anger, he decided he'd deal with the Beggars' union, even if it was for that kid's sake. He looked at the water and saw his reflection, wondering who this child he saw was. He thought about the idea of reincarnation in Buddhism and regretted not going to Shaolin Temple instead of Mount Hua if he knew it was possible. Out of nowhere, the beggar who'd left when Chung Myung was being beaten returned and called out to him. Chung Myung turned around, recognized him, and asked if he was the one who'd left earlier. The beggar asked if he was okay and said that the young beggar, Wang Cho, who beat him, always got carried away, but today he'd gone too far. Chung Myung cut the young beggar off and raised his finger, saying he had one question. Then, after a moment, he changed his mind and raised two fingers, asking to be allowed two questions. They both looked at each other, and the beggar seemed puzzled. After a moment of silence, Chung Myung asked seriously if he was a beggar. The young beggar answered, saying it was obvious they were both beggars, looking at Chung Myung's torn clothes. Chung Myung sat down, scratching his head, frustrated and unable to believe he had become a beggar. Then he turned to the young beggar and asked his second question, demanding to know who Chun Ma was. The young beggar looked at Chung Myung, annoyed, and commented that he'd initially thought he was acting normally for someone who'd been badly beaten, but now it seemed he was mistaken. Losing his patience, Chung Myung shouted at the young beggar to just answer his question. The young beggar sighed and replied that he knew who Chun Ma was. He used to be the leader of the Heavenly Demon Sect, but he died 100 years ago. Hearing this, Chung Myung was shocked and shouted in disbelief, repeating that Chun Ma had died 100 years ago, gripping the young beggar's shirt tightly. The young beggar felt puzzled by Chung Myung's actions. He asked what Chung Myung was doing, but Chung Myung ignored him and insisted on knowing the truth. The young beggar, honest in his response, saw no reason to lie to Chung Myung. Chung Myung finally let go of the young beggar's shirt. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. 100 years had passed since he had killed Chun Ma. Chung Myung grew frustrated as he wondered why he couldn't have been sent back to the time right after he died. He felt like he had been left behind, in a world that had moved on without him, and couldn't understand how things had gone so wrong. The young beggar noticed Chung Myung's distress and asked if he was okay, but Chung Myung remained lost in his thoughts. He remembered the Mount Hua Sect, once one of the most powerful martial arts sects, and wondered if time had also affected them. Chung Myung turned to the young beggar and asked what had happened to the Mount Hua Sect. However, the young beggar seemed confused and asked what the Mount Hua Sect was. Chung Myung was filled with questions after hearing the young beggar's reply. He asked if the young beggar was a beggar, and the young beggar confirmed it, saying he was like Chung Myung. Chung Myung continued to question and assumed that since the young beggar was part of the Beggars' Union, he must know about the Mount Hua Sect, one of the 10 great sects, just like the Beggars' Union. He couldn't believe that the beggar didn't seem to know what he was talking about, but the beggar looked at Chung Myung with a puzzled expression and asked what nonsense he was talking about. He then listed the 10 great sects, including the Shaolin Temple, the Wudang Ashen Sect, the Kongtong Sect, the Chingcheng Sect, the Lotus Order, the Southern Island Sect, the Kunlun Sect, the Beggars' Union, and the Southern Edge Sect. He stated that there was no such thing as the Mount Hua Sect among them. Chung Myung was left bewildered by the beggar's response, wondering how the Mount Hua Sect wasn't one of the 10 great sects. He grabbed the young beggar's shirt and shook him in surprise. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. The Southern Island Sect had become one of the 10 great sects, and the Mount Hua Sect was no longer part of them. Chung Myung's focus quickly shifted as he demanded to know more about the Mount Hua Sect. The young beggar struggled to remember anything useful until he suddenly recalled something about the Shanxi province map. He mentioned that he had heard of such a sect before and suggested it might be on the Shanxi province map somewhere. Chung Myung was immediately intrigued and asked if the young beggar knew more. The beggar continued, saying that while he wasn't sure if the Mount Hua Sect was one of the 10 great sects, he did know that the sect had already fallen. Chung Myung was shocked by the news. He couldn't believe that the Mount Hua Sect, one of the top 3 sects in the world alongside the Wudang and the Northern Loyalty family, had fallen. He let go of the young beggar, who fell to the ground. Chung Myung refused to accept the news and insisted on seeing it for himself. The young beggar, now on the ground, looked puzzled as Chung Myung spoke. Chung Myung announced that he was going to Mount Hua to confirm the situation. The beggar cautioned him, suggesting that he might get hurt again, and recommended begging instead. Chung Myung angrily silenced him and asked more questions. He pointed to himself and asked the beggar for his name. The beggar questioned why a beggar would have a name, but eventually revealed that Chung Myung's name was Cho Sam. Chung Myung then asked about the beggar's age, to which the beggar replied that beggars didn't keep track of their age. Chung Myung guessed the beggar's age to be around 15 or 16 based on his appearance. He continued questioning, asking for the beggar's name and the name of the person who had beaten him. The beggar, surprised by these questions, asked if Chung Myung didn't remember anything. He then introduced himself as Ku 7, and the person who had beaten Chung Myung was Ku 8, known as Wang Cho. Chung Myung vowed to repay favors twofold and grudges tenfold, and asked Ku 7 to remember his name, Chung Myung of the Mount Hua Sect, promising to settle the score the next time they met. Afterward, Chung Myung started to walk away, but soon returned to ask Ku 7 for directions to Mount Hua in Shanxi province. Ku 7, with no other choice, sighed and gave him the information. Chung Myung wasted no time and began running. With every step, he felt the strain on his body. He couldn't believe he was moving on foot without any transportation. Despite exhaustion and his face turning red, Chung Myung pushed on, reminding himself that he had never ridden anything as slow as a horse, even in his past life. But running was taking a toll on him, and he stumbled to the ground, gasping for breath. Frustrated, he exclaimed that he might die from this effort, realizing that his body was not up for such a task, and he was already tired after just a few minutes of running. He couldn't help thinking about the tough journey he faced. How could he ever reach Shanxi province in his current weak state? He feared he might pass out or even die on the way. But then, Chung Myung smiled, revealing a plan. This was where his cunning and trickery would come into play. Chung Myung's determination grew as he pulled his face from the ground and laughed wildly, filled with excitement. He knew he just needed to train in martial arts to seize this opportunity. Chung Myung understood that even those who had mastered martial arts regretted not focusing on the basics when they were younger. They also wished they had trained harder when their seniors advised them to, instead of sneaking the liquor their Sa-Young had hidden. Chung Myung remembered the taste of the alcohol, calling it delicious. As he walked, he resolved to find a place where he could avoid the physical world as much as possible. Sitting under a tree, Chung Myung contemplated his next steps. He possessed vast knowledge of advanced martial arts techniques, the history of the Mount Hua Sect, and methods of inner chi cultivation. He knew he could easily learn techniques beyond those taught in the sect. Yet, Chung Myung chose to start with a basic technique called equilibrium, often sold in illegal street markets. It wasn't a powerful inner chi technique, but it was excellent for purifying the body. Chung Myung recognized the importance of building a strong foundation for his inner strength. Perfecting equilibrium was the first step. He understood the need to cleanse any impure energy absorbed from his surroundings, akin to fixing a small misalignment in a large fabric thread by thread. If he could gather this purified energy into his dantian, he believed he'd become a formidable martial artist. Chung Myung finished his equilibrium training, feeling a sense of happiness. His newly developed dantian would be the foundation for a new world. With a small but solid energy core, he believed it would grow into an unstoppable force. He thought about rushing to Mount Hua to test his new skills, but felt something was wrong. The next moment, he collapsed to the ground. Lying on the ground, Chung Myung realized he had exhausted all his energy while learning the technique. Equilibrium didn't help when he needed to use his body right away, and he cursed his bad luck. Just then, he saw an image of his friend Sa-hyung and heard his voice. Sa-hyung told Chung Myung that sometimes he forgot to use his brain. However, Chung Myung was irritated and told Sa-hyung to leave because he was bothering him. With a feeling of desperation, Chung Myung shouted, wondering how he would reach Mount Hua at this rate. In a village, a young beggar in a hurry walked into a street and approached an older man, calling him brother. The older beggar asked what was going on. The young beggar explained that a new beggar was taking all their begging money. He described this beggar as a kid who looked innocent, and everyone gave their coins to him. The older beggar stood up and said they needed to teach the new beggar a lesson. The young beggar pointed at another beggar, who turned out to be Chung Myung. The older beggar yelled at Chung Myung, but he didn't react and kept eating. The older beggar shouted again, calling Chung Myung a brat and asking if he was deaf. Chung Myung looked back and casually asked if the older beggar was talking about him. This angered the older beggar, and he accused Chung Myung of speaking disrespectfully, thinking the kid had lost his mind at a young age. Cracking his knuckles, the older beggar warned Chung Myung that he needed permission to beg there. He said he would spare Chung Myung because he was young, but only if he left everything he had and left. Chung Myung looked at the beggars and then at his bun. He called the beggars out, saying they had no shame and were even taking his food. The young beggar became angry and called Chung Myung a rude brat. Chung Myung got up and stretched his arms, then punched the air a few times, testing his strength. He mentioned that his dantian wasn't perfect yet, but it would do for now. He warned the beggars that he was weak and wouldn't hit them very hard, but they were welcome to attack him all at once. The older beggar became furious and ordered the two younger beggars to attack Chung Myung. As they rushed to attack him, Chung Myung easily dodged the young beggar's punch and countered with a punch of his own, sending the young beggar flying. Chung Myung shouted at the beggars, declaring himself the Plum Blossom Sword Saint of the Great Mount Hua Sect. He fought back and began to defeat the three beggars. After beating them up, all three beggars kneeled with their bodies covered in bruises. The elderly beggar apologized for their actions while addressing Chung Myung as chief. Chung Myung, who was eating a bun, asked why the beggar called him a chief. The beggar inquired if he should be called Chief Beggar, but this made Chung Myung angry, and he questioned if the beggar had just called him a beggar. The older beggar then bowed and said sorry again. Chung Myung asked if they knew the quickest way to get to Shanxi province. The older beggar thought for a moment and burst into laughter, saying that he was asking something obvious. Chung Myung thought the beggar might have some knowledge, so he asked if he knew about Shanxi province. The older beggar chuckled and replied that if they knew such things, they wouldn't be beggars. Chung Myung didn't say anything, and simply looked at the old beggar. Chung Myung started smiling and said that he seemed to be asking the wrong person. He then laughed, and the older beggar joined in. Suddenly, Chung Myung grabbed the older beggar's shirt, surprising him. The beggar looked at Chung Myung with a puzzled expression, as he warned him that if they were to meet again in the future, he should have an answer ready if Chung Myung were to ask him something. Otherwise, he might not be so lucky next time. Chung Myung then told them to leave if they understood him, and they quickly ran away, responding in a frightened voice that they got his message. In a beautiful valley surrounded by mountains, an elderly man stood by a window, admiring the stunning view and the blooming plum blossoms. Suddenly, someone outside called him sect leader. The sect leader turned around and warmly welcomed the person, Un-am, to come inside. Un-am entered the room and mentioned that a child was asking to meet the sect leader, but it didn't seem like a matter of great importance. The sect leader looked outside and saw Chung Myung standing there, raising his hands in greeting. Chung Myung respectfully greeted the sect leader, introduced himself, and expressed his desire to join the Mount Hua Sect. The sect leader pondered and asked Un-am if he had told Chung Myung that they were not accepting new members. Un-am confirmed that he had, but despite that, Chung Myung was eager to meet the sect leader. As they turned toward Chung Myung, he appeared to be smiling, but deep down, he was quite irritated. To understand why, let's go back a few moments. Chung Myung had arrived at Mount Hua with a stick in his hand and was panting heavily. He thought about the shortcut the three beggars had mentioned, but it didn't help him much. Nevertheless, he had finally made it here, and he swore to himself that he wouldn't forgive the beggars if he ever encountered them again. With determination in his eyes, Chung Myung began climbing the stairs, panting heavily. He promised himself to climb as if his life depended on it. After ascending the stairs, Chung Myung started climbing the mountain. Suddenly, the rock he was holding onto slipped, but he managed to regain his balance. He held the stick in his mouth and looked down, thinking that if he kept going, he could achieve anything. Climbing on, he promised himself that he'd make it to the top of Mount Hua. Finally reaching the summit, Chung Myung stood there, breathing heavily. He couldn't believe his eyes when he saw that the Mount Hua Sect's signboard was gone. Frustration boiled up in him as he remembered the past and how Sahyung Jangmun used to clean that signboard every morning. He wondered where it had disappeared and was close to losing his mind. Just then, the sect's door swung open and someone asked who was there. Unam looked at Chung Myung and realized he was just a kid. Unam inquired if Chung Myung had come alone and how he managed to make the journey all by himself. Chung Myung stared at Unam but didn't answer the question. He thought to himself that he had literally just climbed up here. Nevertheless, he cleared his throat and told Unam that he had something to ask. He wanted to know if Unam practiced martial arts at the Mount Hua Sect. Unam confirmed he was indeed from the Mount Hua Sect. Chung Myung felt relieved that the sect hadn't completely vanished. Unam interrupted his thoughts and invited him inside. Chung Myung looked at him curiously and asked what was going on. Unam explained that they weren't accepting any outsiders, but it was too late for him to descend the mountain. He added that they couldn't allow a guest of the Mount Hua Sect to go back down in the middle of the night because it got very cold on Mount Hua after dark. As Chung Myung entered through the sect's door, he was surprised by what he saw. The training grounds had a dirt floor, and he wondered why they didn't use marble stones instead. Unam noticed his expression and asked what was bothering him. Chung Myung tried to compose himself and forced a smile, saying that the training ground was very spacious and nice. Unam seemed content with his response. However, as they continued walking, Chung Myung noticed that an entire building was missing, and it shocked him. He couldn't believe it. What had happened to the Heavenly Golden Palace? Chung Myung pointed to the missing structure and asked Unam if it had always been empty. Unam responded with a sigh, acknowledging that Chung Myung had noticed too. He explained that palaces used to stand there, but they are now gone. Chung Myung wondered where they had disappeared to, but Unam just chuckled and said that it wasn't something someone of Chung Myung's age would know. He admitted that it was embarrassing for a martial artist to admit, but it was a wound to their once glorious history. Chung Myung wasn't convinced and muttered, "Glory my foot." Unam asked him what he had said, but Chung Myung quickly brushed it off, saying it was nothing. Unam motioned for Chung Myung to follow him silently. As they walked, Chung Myung's mind drifted. He couldn't help but feel sorry for the Mount Hua Sect's decision to sell the Heavenly Golden Palace. He realized that they must have faced many challenges and difficulties trying to keep the sect from disappearing until now. After a while, Unam stopped in front of a building and said it was the Yuyuan Temple. Chung Myung took a moment to look at the temple and noticed it looked fine. Unam opened the door and signaled for Chung Myung to enter. He whispered that the Mount Hua Sect was a martial arts sect, and guests had certain responsibilities, like paying respects to their ancestors. So he told Chung Myung to prepare for that. Inside the room, Chung Myung had a puzzled expression on his face. He noticed that several valuable items were missing, including a golden candlestick given by ancestor Daitong Hak from the Jin dynasty's emperor, a handwritten hanging scroll by the ancestor, gold-plated decorations, and paintings that used to adorn the room. He scanned the room and suddenly looked surprised. He realized that a flower was missing and exclaimed, wondering where it had gone. Unam, puzzled by Chung Myung's odd behavior, asked him which flower he meant. Chung Myung looked back and explained that there was supposed to be a flower in the room and wondered aloud where it had disappeared. Unam heard the question and inquired how Chung Myung knew about the flower. After thinking for a moment, Unam recalled that there used to be a plum blossom made of a strange white metal in the room. Chung Myung's eyes brightened with recognition, and he urgently asked about the flower's whereabouts. As Chung Myung listened to Unam's explanation with a concerned expression, Unam smiled and revealed the truth. They had sold the flower because they couldn't find a use for it, and it didn't match the temple's decor. Fortunately, they found a merchant willing to buy it at a good price. Chung Myung had a moment of shock and despair as he fell to his knees. He thought about the sad fate of the Mount Hua Sect and how they had lost their precious artifacts. These were the white plum blossom of the nocturnal fragrance and the divine sword of the violet dawn. The white plum blossom of the nocturnal fragrance wasn't as shiny as gold or as flashy as silver, but it held the righteous spirit of the Mount Hua Sect, making it a sacred item. And now, someone had foolishly sold it. As Chung Myung knelt, Unam rushed to him and asked if he was okay. Chung Myung knew he had to intervene quickly to prevent further chaos. Suddenly, he bowed to Unam and made a request. He asked Unam to allow him to meet with the sect leader and become a part of the Mount Hua Sect. The scene then shifted to the present, where the sect leader looked at Chung Myung with curiosity. He asked if Chung Myung was familiar with the Mount Hua Sect, since he wanted to join. Chung Myung confirmed his knowledge and desire to join, and the sect leader considered the request. He knew that getting into the sect wouldn't be easy. As he thought about his next move, Chung Myung had a plan. He decided to use the name Chung Jin, who was said to have disappeared during a war. Chung Myung explained that Chung Jin had fallen off a cliff and was found by a passing lumberjack who treated his injuries. In gratitude, Chung Jin had taught the lumberjack the martial arts of the Mount Hua Sect and treated him as a disciple. Chung Myung then revealed that he was the descendant of that lumberjack. A smile crossed Chung Myung's face as he thought this was a perfect scenario. He was pleased he could establish a strong position in the sect with this story. As the grandson of the lumberjack, his status would technically be on par with the sect leader. This situation not only sounded impressive, but also put him in a higher position than the younger members. Chung Myung eagerly awaited the sect leader's response, ready for potential rejection or questions. However, Chung Myung was surprised when the sect leader unexpectedly approved his entry into the sect. He looked at the sect leader in confusion, trying to understand what had just happened. The sect leader explained that if Chung Myung genuinely wanted to join, he should be allowed to do so. Even Unam was taken aback by this decision, reminding the sect leader of his previous statement about not accepting new members. However, the sect leader had a change of heart, believing it might be destiny to accept Chung Myung into the sect. Chung Myung couldn't believe his luck, and he couldn't help but think that the sect leader should have been more cautious about welcoming strangers. The sect leader explained his philosophy back then. He said they didn't shoo away birds or animals in the winter, and they couldn't turn away a desperate child either. The sect leader told Unam to find a place for Chung Myung to stay and get ready for the entrance ceremony. Unam agreed quickly and promised to prepare everything right away. Chung Myung's plan had failed, and instead of being equal to the sect leader, he ended up at the lowest point. He felt disappointed that his scheme hadn't gone as planned. Chung Myung put on his new uniform and sighed, feeling disappointed in himself for wearing a third-rank disciple's clothes. He looked around the room, trying to figure out where he was. He remembered that this place used to be a guest room. He peeked outside the room's door and found it strange that this was a temporary place for future sect members. He remembered that the Mount Hua Sect didn't have private boarding rooms originally. New members would immediately bond with their teacher and stay in their rooms. He walked outside his room, curious, and peeked into a nearby room. To his surprise, he saw people staying in those rooms. Suddenly, a voice from behind startled him. Chung Myung turned to find a Mount Hua Sect disciple in uniform standing there, questioning his intentions and asking if he was a thief.